The snowfall had just begun when Julian stepped into the small, cluttered second-hand shop at the edge of town. He hadn't meant to linger. He only wanted shelter from the cold. But something in the dusty quiet drew him deeper, past piles of forgotten furniture and shelves bowed by the weight of old lives. The air smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. It was the kind of place where memories seemed to cling to every object, waiting patiently for someone to notice them again. He moved slowly, almost absent-mindedly, until a worn cardboard box caught his eye. It sat beneath a crooked table, half hidden, as though it had been placed there by someone who wasn't sure whether to let it go or keep it safe. Julian knelt, lifted the lid, and stilled. Inside lay a single photograph. Its edges were frayed, softened by decades of touch, yet the image itself was startlingly alive. A young woman stood beneath a willow tree at dusk, her face turned slightly toward the light, caught between shadow and something like longing. There was a quiet sadness in her posture, and a strange, impossible hope in her eyes. Julian felt something shift inside him, a tug, subtle at first, then unmistakable. It was as though the photograph had chosen him. He bought it without asking questions, without even understanding why, and as he stepped back into the cold evening air, he kept looking at her, at the softness of her expression, the stillness of her hands, the depth of something unnamed lingering behind her gaze. Who was she? Why had this image survived when everything else in the box had vanished? That night at his small apartment, Julian placed the photograph on his desk. The room was dim, lit only by the warm glow of his desk lamp, and yet the woman in the picture seemed illuminated from within. He felt an ache he could not explain, a familiarity he couldn't place. It was not attraction, not in the usual sense. It was recognition, as if she embodied a moment in time he had once lived but forgotten. Outside, the wind brushed against his windows like a wandering voice. Inside, Julian traced the faded edges of the photograph and whispered to no one in particular, "I need to know who you are." And with that single thought, quiet, fragile, almost accidental, the journey began. A journey he did not yet understand, toward a truth that waited patient and trembling just beyond the horizon of his life. Julian woke the next morning with the photograph still resting beside him, the woman's face glowing faintly in the early light. He hadn't meant to fall asleep staring at her, yet something about her presence, even captured in paper and ink, had woven itself into his dreams. She felt close, too close, he realized, for someone he had never met. He brewed his coffee slowly, the bitter scent filling his small kitchen, and propped the photograph against a jar so he could study it once more. The willow tree, the slant of the sunlight, the old stone path beneath her feet. Every detail seemed deliberate, almost waiting to be understood. He enlarged the image on his computer, searching for something, anything, that could help identify the place. And there it was, a faint outline of a wooden pier stretching into a lake, blurred by distance but unmistakable. He knew that lake, not well, but enough to feel a small shiver of recognition. It lay in a quiet valley north of the city, a place he had visited only once as a child. And so, on a breath he barely acknowledged, Julian packed his camera bag and set out. The journey took him through winding forest roads where sunlight fell in broken fragments across the windshield. He drove slowly, sensing that haste might break the thread he was following. Fragile, invisible, but undeniably real. When he finally arrived at the valley, The lake shimmered with the muted colors of late afternoon. The willow tree was still there, older now, its branches heavier, but unmistakably the same. He stood beneath it, holding the photograph beside the living scene, marveling at how time had softened the world, but not erased it. A strange ache settled in his chest, a mixture of awe and something like sorrow. Whoever she was, she had stood here once, she had waited here once, and he felt, without knowing why, that the place remembered her. A voice drifted from behind him, soft, low, threaded with curiosity. He turned. An elderly groundskeeper stood nearby, wiping his hands on an old cloth. Julian held up the photograph. "Do you recognize this place?" he asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. The man leaned close, squinting, then nodded slowly. Yes. It was taken here long ago." A pause. "But the girl? The girl hasn't been seen in years." Julian felt the world tilt slightly, as though a door had opened somewhere deep within the silence. "Who was she?" he asked. The man shook his head. No one ever knew her name. She came here often, always alone. Then one day she stopped coming. A gust of wind rustled the willow branches above them, scattering golden leaves across the path. Julian tightened his grip on the photograph, feeling an old mystery stirring awake, pulling him further in. The groundskeeper walked away, leaving Julian alone with the lake, the fading light, and a question that had begun to take root in him. What happened to her? The answer, he sensed, was not here, but the photograph, and whatever force had placed it in his hands, wanted him to find it. And so, under the canopy of the willow tree, Julian whispered a quiet promise to the woman he had never met. "I'll keep looking." And the journey deepened. Julian returned to the city with the photograph resting on the passenger seat. As if it were a fragile passenger he was afraid to disturb. The willow tree had given him a place, but not a name, and yet something inside him felt unmistakably awakened, as though the journey was no longer a choice, but a calling that had quietly claimed him. That night he spread the photograph across his desk and began searching for patterns he might have missed. He scanned the edges, the shadows, the faint lines in the background. A small detail caught his eye, a bracelet on the woman's wrist half hidden by her sleeve. Delicate, silver, shaped like a crescent moon. It felt symbolic, intentional, a clue left behind by someone who never meant to be found, or perhaps by someone who desperately hoped to be. The next morning he visited antique shops, photography studios, and small cafes where local artists gathered. Most shook their heads politely, offered a kind smile, but no recognition. Still, Julian felt the pull, a whisper of intuition guiding him to continue. He walked through narrow streets, past weathered brick buildings and fog-filled alleys, until he found himself standing before a tiny art gallery he'd never noticed before. Inside, the space was warm, lined with old photographs and paintings that seemed to hum with stories. Behind the counter sat a woman with silver hair pulled into a loose braid, her gaze sharp and knowing, as though she saw more than she let on. Julian hesitated, then handed her the photograph. The moment her eyes fell upon it, something in her expression shifted, a flicker of recognition, softened by something else, perhaps grief. "Where did you find this?" she asked quietly. Julian explained. The thrift shop, the journey to the lake, the unanswered questions. She listened without interruption, her fingers lightly trembling against the photo's edge. "I knew her," she finally whispered. "She came here once, many years ago." She wanted someone to photograph her, to capture a moment before everything changed. Julian leaned forward. "Do you know her name?" The woman swallowed, as if the memory carried weight. "She called herself Mira," she said softly, "but I don't know if that was her real name." Mira. The name settled into Julian's chest like a heartbeat he had been missing. He asked where she had gone, what had happened to her, but the gallery owner shook her head. She vanished. One day she stopped coming. People said she left the country. Others said she was running from something. Julian felt the ache of it, the grief of a story interrupted, a life that slipped between the cracks of time. Before he could ask more, the gallery owner reached into a drawer and pulled out a small envelope sealed with yellowed tape. "She left this here," she murmured. "Said that if anyone ever came looking for her, really looking, I should give it to them." Julian stared at the envelope in disbelief, his pulse quickening. "For me?" he breathed. The woman nodded. "You're the first." Julian took the envelope, the paper warm from her touch, and felt a tremor run through him. Inside was a single photograph, another image of Mira, standing on a city rooftop, her eyes full of something he couldn't yet understand. And on the back, written in delicate handwriting, "If you found this, it means the past has finally begun to move." Julian closed his eyes. The journey was no longer about a forgotten photograph. It was about a woman who had left pieces of herself, scattered like breadcrumbs, waiting for someone willing to follow. And Julian knew, with startling certainty, that he would not stop now. The story, Mira's story, had only begun to surface. Julian walked through the city with Mira's second photograph tucked carefully inside his coat, the rooftop image echoing like a quiet pulse against his heart. The words on the back, "The past has finally begun to move," stayed with him, lingering in the space between thought and instinct. He felt as though he had stepped onto a path she once walked, and the air still carried her footprints. He returned home and placed both photographs side by side beneath the warm lamplight. Two versions of Mira looked back at him, one at the Willow Lake, serene and unreachable, the other on a rooftop, eyes shadowed with something unspoken, almost fearful. Julian traced the faded edges with his fingertips, sensing a story woven between them, a story she had never allowed herself to finish. As evening deepened into night, he searched for rooftops in the city that matched the one behind her. Most led nowhere. Construction sites, old buildings, private terraces. Each wrong turn only sharpened his determination, until finally, just before midnight, he found a place that felt right, an old apartment complex overlooking the river, its rooftop accessible through a rusted iron door. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step echoing with a strange anticipation. When he pushed the door open, the city lights spilled into the night, and for a moment Julian forgot to breathe. The view matched the photograph exactly. Mira had stood here. Her shadow had once stretched across these stones, and on the far side of the rooftop, hidden behind a row of potted plants and broken lanterns, he noticed a small wooden box, weathered, untouched, waiting. Julian knelt and lifted the lid. Inside were remnants of a life deliberately scattered, a dried flower pressed between torn notebook pages, a metro ticket folded with careful precision, and a small journal wrapped in a silk ribbon, its cover worn soft from use. His hands shook as he opened it. The first page was blank, but on the second, Mira's handwriting flowed across the paper like a whisper. "I leave pieces of myself behind so I don't disappear entirely." Julian felt the weight of those words settle into him, heavy, wounded, and achingly human. The journal was not long, barely 20 pages, but each entry revealed fragments of a woman living in the space between escape and hope. She wrote of running, of hiding, of losing someone she couldn't bear to lose, of fearing that if anyone truly saw her, they would be dragged into the darkness she carried. And near the final page, a sentence written with trembling ink: "If someday someone searches for me, I hope they search with gentleness." Julian closed the journal slowly, feeling a gravity he had never known before. He wasn't simply piecing together a mystery. He was stepping into someone's pain, someone's past, someone's unfinished life. He stood at the edge of the rooftop and looked out over the river, the city lights blurring into soft halos. Where was she now? What had driven her to leave so many traces, yet no path to follow? And why did he feel, with growing certainty, that this journey was no longer about curiosity, but connection? Julian pressed the journal to his chest, the cool night air brushing against his skin. Somewhere out there, Mira still lived, somewhere behind fogged memories and quiet distance, and he knew now that he would not stop searching, because the past wasn't the only thing beginning to move. His heart was too. Julian waited for Mira the next day, but she never came to the cafe. Not that morning, not that afternoon, not even in the quiet hour before closing, when she usually slipped in like a sigh carried by the evening wind. For the first time since they met, her absence felt like a shadow stretching across the day. He carried the small journal with him everywhere, in his coat pocket, close to his heart, though he hadn't yet found the courage to tell her he'd discovered it. It wasn't fear of her reaction, not exactly. It was fear of breaking something fragile, something unnamed, something growing between them in the spaces where their words kept stopping. As night fell, he wandered along the riverfront, the same place where Mira liked to disappear into the fog. Lights shimmered across the water like trembling memories, and Julian felt the chill of uncertainty settle at the base of his spine. Had he pushed too far? Had she sensed his search and slipped away again, the way she once slipped out of her own life? He tried calling her name into the fog, quietly, gently, but the mist swallowed his voice whole. On the far end of the walkway, he noticed movement. A familiar figure sitting on a bench, hunched forward, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Mira. Julian approached carefully, like approaching a wounded bird that might fly at the slightest sound. When she finally looked up, her eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, not from sleeplessness, but from wrestling, a past she no longer had the strength to carry. He sat beside her without a word. The silence wrapped around them, thick yet strangely comforting, a silence where neither of them had to pretend. Mira's voice broke it first, soft, barely more than a breath. "I thought I could outrun this," she murmured, though no details followed. Her confession hung between them, incomplete but heavy enough to shift the air. Julian didn't press, didn't ask. He simply waited, and slowly, painfully, Mira began to unravel, thread by trembling thread. She told him that the girl in the photographs was not just a version of her. She was a version she lost, a version who once loved the wrong person, a version who once trusted someone who shattered more than her heart, a version who disappeared because it was the only way to survive. Julian's breath caught, the urge to hold her, to anchor her, to ease the ache in her voice. It nearly overwhelmed him, but he kept his hands still, knowing touch can either mend or break, depending on the moment. Mira stared at the river as though the shifting currents could rewrite the past. "I left pieces of myself everywhere," she whispered, "and I'm afraid if someone finds them all, they'll see who I really am." Julian gently placed the journal between them. He didn't push it toward her. He didn't explain how he found it. He simply let it rest there, an offering of truth. Her breath hitched. Recognition flickered in her eyes, but she didn't run. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she reached for it with trembling fingers and closed it softly, as if sealing a wound. For a long moment, nothing moved. Not the fog, not the water, not their hearts, suspended in the fragile balance of choosing to stay or choosing to flee. Then Mira whispered, "You shouldn't have searched for me." Julian's reply was quiet, steady, unshaken. "If I hadn't searched, I never would have found you." The fog thickened around them like a veil, blurring the world until only the two of them existed. A man holding hope, and a woman holding fear. It was not a resolution, but it was a beginning, and in that moment, beginning was enough. The next morning rose slowly, as though the sun itself hesitated behind the clouds, unsure whether to step into the world Mira and Julian were still trying to understand. A pale, gentle light drifted across the riverfront, softening the sharp edges of the night before. But Mira did not come to the cafe. She did not appear along the walkway, nor in the narrow alleys she used to wander when she needed silence more than company. Julian waited anyway, not with impatience, but with a quiet, steady hope that felt strangely like certainty. By noon, he realized that finding her wouldn't be a matter of searching, not anymore. It would be a matter of trusting that Mira was finally searching for herself. And she was. Mira stood before the abandoned warehouse where the photograph had been taken decades earlier, a place she had avoided for years, because inside those brick walls lived the version of her who had once believed she could be loved without being broken. Dust drifted through the shattered windows like memories made visible. She stepped inside. For a long moment she simply breathed, letting the air settle around her, letting the silence tell her what she already knew. She could not change what had happened in this place, but she could decide what it would mean from now on. The echo of old footsteps, her own, seemed to move through the empty space, and with each heartbeat she felt the weight of the past loosen, just enough for her lungs to fill, truly fill, for the first time in years. When she emerged back into the daylight, Julian was there. He didn't ask how she found him. He didn't rush toward her or speak her name with urgency. He simply stood, hands in his pockets, eyes searching hers with a hope he tried, but failed, to hide. Mira walked toward him with slow, deliberate steps. The journal was in her hands, not held tightly in fear this time, but calmly, openly, as if it no longer frightened her. She stopped a breath away from him. "Julian," she said softly, "I don't know how to let someone in without disappearing, but I'm tired of being lost." A quiet wind moved between them, carrying the scent of river water and early spring. Julian's voice, when it came, was barely louder than the breeze. "You don't have to disappear," he murmured. "Not anymore." She exhaled, a fragile, trembling release, and placed the journal gently into his hands. "Then help me rewrite it," she whispered. "Not erase, not forget. Rewrite." Julian opened the cover, not to read, but simply to understand the weight she had carried. When he lifted his gaze again, her eyes held something he had never seen in them before. Not fear, not grief, but permission. They walked together along the riverbank, the morning light warming their faces, the past no longer pulling them backward, but settling behind them like a chapter finally ready to close. And though no promises were spoken, the silence between them shifted, no longer heavy, no longer fragile, but full of a new beginning taking shape. For the first time, Mira allowed herself to imagine a future not defined by what broke her, but by who chose to stay. And Julian knew he had not found a photograph. He had found a life. The girl from the forgotten picture was no longer lost. She had stepped out of the frame and into the present, where she was finally ready to be seen.
Thank you for listening. I'm grateful you chose to spend this time here. New stories arrive every week, and I hope you'll return for the next one.